Welcome to this week's study. We hope and pray that you've been enjoying and growing in this study of the Spiritual Emphasis campaign. God bless you as you listen to this message from our senior pastor, Reverend George Shiramba.
The giving up or feeling powerless is one of the greatest dangers any human being can face. And from our creation, our power, our identity, our image comes from God. And so when we rely on God and when we depend on God and when we draw our power from God, then we are strong. But when we fail to look to God, then what happens is, as a people, we begin to be powerless. And so when we face situations, then we are unable to handle those situations because we begin to feel powerless. And the sad thing about feeling powerless is you begin to feel like you're a passive victim, that you cannot do anything about it. And when you begin to feel like you have a situation that you cannot do anything about it, the situation takes over you as opposed to you taking over the situation. And so being in God and getting your power, getting your purpose and your meaning from God then enables you to handle situations. Because in any case, God is above all situations. God is above all situations that threaten us. And that is why we need to rely on God. And that is why then we need to stand firm, to be not to live in fear, not to feel threatened by situations and circumstances. So there are two ways. There's the external fear from external threats, and this always happens. For example, if you look at the situations when the Israelites were in Egypt, when they were in slavery in Egypt, there was the physical abuse, there was a enslavement where they would go and work the whole day, and God delivered them from the physical and external fear that they had, who were the Egyptians, their slave masters. But inside they were still enslaved to their own fears, who they were. Psychologically they were still enslaved. And so from Egypt, God then takes them to the Red Sea. And at the point of the Red Sea, at the point of crossing, they are delivered from the psychological fears of the Egyptians. And so not only does God deliver them from external fear, but He brings them to a place where He begins to deliver them from psychological fear. As they see the sea opening, they see the power of God, and they see their physical outside situation dealt with, that is the Egyptians drowning, and they are free. But God continues to free them from their internal fears in the desert by providing for them, by assuring them, by walking with them. And so we need to always be aware of external fears, but we also need to be internal worries. Now, I need to also say that there are cases where fear can be as a result of a chemical imbalance. And in such cases, you need to consult the experts, you need to consult your doctor so that you're guided. And this happens especially if your fear is very prolonged or if your fear is very abnormal for an extended period of time. Or you can even ask your friends and they can actually help you and give you some direction on how you handle your fears, especially your internal fears. Usually breaking generational or cultural fear can be very complex because sometimes we are in a situation, we may be in that situation and we may not even know the history of that culture or the history of how we found ourselves in that culture. The other challenge with cultural fear and generational fear is, under normal circumstances, it is normal until you get exposed either to another culture or you get exposed to someone else comes and tells you that this is not normal. And that sometimes requires knowledge, sometimes it requires you to get outside of the box, to see exactly what happens outside of there. So knowledge becomes very important when you're dealing with cultural and generational fear that you need to deal with. So if your society is dealing, or your people around you are dealing with certain fears, or they have put certain limits and restrictions around you that cause a lot of fear, it is always good to read more, ask more, look out more, but most important is actually to go to the Bible, because the Bible is the word that God has given us. Is the one who created us from the very beginning, before we got into the culture of sin and the culture of fallenness, before we got even into generational limitations and generational captivity. So my challenge to all of us is actually to get into the Word of God and find out, what does the Word of God say vis-a-vis what your culture says? Jesus was born in a culture, but he was not enslaved or imprisoned by that culture, because there are certain things in the culture that he sensed were wrong, and he decided not to be part of that culture that was wrong. But there are certain things that were right, and he chose to be part of that which is right. And when you read the Bible, you'll find some things in the culture that were okay, he lived within them. But then there were some things that he outrightly rejected, because they were not in line with the Word of God. And so the Word of God becomes the foundation of what you should depend on to determine the whole issue of fear, the whole issue of generational fear, the whole issue of cultural fear, so that you're not caught up in a culture or in a generation, but you should be caught up in the Word of God, and you should be caught up in what God says. And so my challenge to you today is, go and study the Word of God, find out what God is telling you in your circumstances, find out what God is telling you in your situation, and challenge and measure everything based on the Word of God.